The morning the new tutor arrived at Ashvale, it had been raining since before first light, and Miss Clara Fenwick was already on her knees in the schoolroom, trying to coax a failing fire into something that might warm a child. She had been the only person in that room since October. The coal was low, the windows leaked cold air through their frames, and the boy had not come down to lessons in 3 days because his chest had tightened again. The whole estate felt like something holding its breath, waiting for a thing that would not come. She heard boots on the stone passage outside. Not the light shuffle of Griggs the footman, and not the heavy deliberate tread of the steward. Mr. Collings, who walked as though the floors owed him something. These footsteps were measured. Quiet. The step of someone long practiced at moving through a house without announcing himself. The door opened. He was tall enough that he had to bend his head a fraction beneath the lintel, though he pretended not to. He wore a coat that had once been good and was now simply clean, and he carried a worn leather satchel that he set on the table with the economy of someone accustomed to setting things down in unfamiliar rooms. His hair was dark and damp from the rain. His face was angular, composed, and arranged into the mild expression of a man who wished to be underestimated. Clara rose from the hearth, brushing ash from her skirt. She noticed his hands first, as she noticed most things about people she could not yet account for. They were not a tutor's hands. A tutor's hands were ink-stained and slightly soft. These were the hands of a man who had spent years doing something that required force and patience in equal measure. "Miss Fenwick," he said. His voice was low, and he used her name as though he had already known it. She was the governess. She was, to the estate of Ashvale and to the season in general, a woman who had come with the position and would leave with it when it ended. To Lady Prentice, who served as the household's self-appointed authority in the absence of any titled presence, Clara was quite simply a necessity of the least interesting sort, the kind of woman one did not need to learn. "The new tutor," Clara said. Not a greeting, precisely. A fact offered back. "Mr. Calder," he said, "I was engaged by correspondence." A pause. "I understand the post has been empty." "Some time." 8 months, Clara said. "Young Lord Ashvale is 9. He reads ahead of his age and has taken against Latin. He has had 3 colds since autumn and does not always tell anyone when his breathing worsens. He will like you or he will not, and there is no predicting which." Something in the composed arrangement of Mr. Calder's face shifted. It was not quite amusement. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man who had expected deflection and received instead a small precise account. "And the household?" he asked. Clara glanced at the door, which she had closed behind him. "Yes. Lady Prentice manages in the absence of any guidance from the estate's trustees. She is not unkind to the boy, but she is impatient with his quietness. The steward Collings oversees the lands. He is," she chose the word carefully, "assured of his own competence." "I see," Mr. Calder said. He did see. That was the thing about him she would come to notice over the following days, then weeks, then the long cold weeks of February when the snow lay so deep that no one came from the village and the house felt stranded in its own silence. He saw things. He noticed what she noticed. He looked at the water staining spreading across the corner of the ceiling, and his jaw tightened by a degree and then relaxed again. He walked the schoolroom's perimeter on that first morning as though checking its dimensions against a map he carried only in his memory, and she could not have explained why she thought so, only that his eyes moved like that, like a man accounting for discrepancies. If you have ever watched someone try very hard not to know a place they know by heart, leave a word for the story below, it is a quiet thing to witness. It is the kind of performance that requires a grief you cannot name aloud. Young Thomas came down to the schoolroom that afternoon. He was small for 9, with his father's dark hair and the cautious, watchful eyes of a child who has had several adults disappear from his life without explanation. He stood in the doorway and assessed Mr. Calder with the thoroughness of someone who had been disappointed before, and intended to be scientific about it this time. "My father was a duke," Thomas said. "I know," said Mr. Calder. He went away when I was 4. No one will tell me exactly where." "No," Mr. Calder said. "I imagined they would not." Thomas considered this answer for a long time. It was not a reassuring answer. It was not an evasive one either. It acknowledged the shape of the thing without filling it in, and something about that honesty seemed to satisfy Thomas in a way that cheerful deflection never had. "Do you know Latin?" Thomas asked. "I do. I hate it." "Most people who are forced to learn it before they want to learn it do," Mr. Calder said. "We shall begin with something else, and return to it when you find you need it." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara kept her face precisely neutral, because she did not want him to see that she was struggling with something she could not name, some sensation at the back of her throat that was not quite alarm and not quite recognition, but occupied the same address as both. She had spent 2 years at Ashvale. She knew its corridors better than its absentee trustees did. She knew the painting in the East Gallery, the 4th Duke of Ashvale in full regalia, younger than the painting made him look, and with a quality in the eyes that his subjects would have read as coldness, and she had always read as sorrow. She had looked at that painting a great many times, in the way one looks at something one cannot account for. She did not look at Mr. Calder directly for the rest of that afternoon. Lady Prentice expressed her view of the new tutor at dinner that evening, to the company of no one in particular. Since Clara did not count, and the only other adult present was Collings, who ate in silence and watched everyone with the particular attention of a man cataloging inventory. "A tutor from where?" "Precisely," Lady Prentice said. She held her wine glass at the angle of a person who had spent many years making wine glasses do social work. "I was given very little to go on. A letter of recommendation from a solicitor in Edinburgh, which strikes me as irregular." "He seems competent," Clara said carefully. "He seems," Lady Prentice repeated, in the tone of someone handing back an object and implying it was not hers to have offered, as though he has opinions about the coal allocation. He had, in fact, said nothing about the coal. He had simply on his second day arranged for a larger supply to be brought up from the cellar, and Clara had not asked him how he had managed it, because she was not certain she wanted to know the answer. The weeks accumulated. Thomas began to eat better. His Latin remained a grudging enterprise, but his natural philosophy accelerated into something that made Clara revise her assessment of what a 9-year-old boy might accomplish, if simply pointed at a question and trusted to pursue it. Calder taught as though the subject mattered, and the student mattered more. He never once spoke down to the child, never simplified in the way that implied limitations, and when Thomas asked a question that stumped him, he said so, and they worked it out together, and the boy's face in those moments was something Clara found she needed to look away from. There was a morning in the 3rd week when Thomas was still at his breakfast, and she found herself alone in the schoolroom with Mr. Calder. He was standing at the tall window looking out over the south field, where the old stone wall separated the kitchen garden from the beginning of the home wood. She watched him without meaning to. His left hand rested on the window frame, and he was very still, watching something she could not see, or perhaps watching nothing at all. "The wall needs repointing," he said. He had not heard her come in, or had chosen not to indicate that he had. "The mortar is going out near the 2nd gate. If it is not addressed by spring, a section will fall." "I have mentioned it to Collings," Clara said. "He said it was not urgent." Mr. Calder said nothing. He turned from the window, and something about the way he moved told her that he had catalogued her answer alongside several others in a private ledger, and that the ledger was growing heavier with each entry. She felt the warmth of the room differently than she had a moment before. She was aware of the precise distance between them, which was appropriate and entirely correct, and she was aware of it in the way one is aware of a sound one cannot quite place. "You have been here 2 years," he said, "and some months. You stayed when the previous steward left, when the last tutor left, when the household reduced its staff by 1/3. She did not know what to do with that sentence. "Thomas needed someone consistent," she said. Mr. Calder looked at her. The look was not brief. It had a quality of attention in it that she was unaccustomed to receiving. Not the appraisal of a superior, not the dismissal of an equal, but something that was slower and more specific, as though he were learning a thing he had already known by another name. "He did," Mr. Calder said. "And he found her." She felt the heat in her face before she could control it. She moved to the desk and opened the lesson book and said nothing. And he said nothing further, and Thomas came in 5 minutes later with ink already on his cuff, and the moment closed. It did not quite close. It went somewhere else instead. It became one of several things. She moved carefully around when she was thinking clearly, and fell into when she was not. Lady Prentice called it exactly what it was. 2 weeks later, at a small dinner to which she had invited 3 families from the nearest town, because Lady Prentice liked an audience for her observations, and an audience of 3 households was the minimum required for proper effect. The dining room at Ashvale was handsome in the way that rooms are handsome when they have been well made and then imperfectly maintained. The plasterwork fine at the ceiling but stained in one corner, the silver polished but reduced from what it had originally been by the slow attrition of an understaffed household. The candlelight did its work generously on the faces of the 6 guests, less generously on the high walls, and not at all on the corner where the stain progressed. Clara sat below the salt, as was correct. She wore her better dress, which was gray with a modest collar, because she had only 2 dresses suitable for the dining room, and the other had a mend at the sleeve that she did not wish to present to a company. She had worn this dress at every dinner since October. The guests did not notice this because guests seldom noticed what the governess wore, which was also correct. The conversation had moved through the usual territories of a winter dinner in the country: the weather, the state of the roads, the health of the district's most prominent elderly resident, and the prospects for the spring hunting. Clara had spoken when addressed, and not otherwise, which was her habitual arrangement with such gatherings, and she had been addressed twice, which was approximately average. It was when the second remove was brought in that Lady Prentice turned to her. "Miss Fenwick," Lady Prentice said in the voice she used when she intended the whole table to hear and pretended to address only one person, "has, I fear, formed something of an attachment to the schoolroom this winter. One understands it. A woman of her station and her the—" Pause was a small practiced instrument. "Limitations must find her satisfactions where she can. She is a governess, and nothing more. We need not be surprised if she mistakes common proximity for something it cannot be." The table's faces arranged themselves into expressions that ranged from embarrassed to entertained. A woman to Clara's left produced a small, sympathetic murmur that was worse than silence. A man across from her found his wineglass suddenly requiring close examination. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. She felt the sentence land, and then she felt it settle, and she recognized the weight of it because she had felt it before, at her first position and at her second. And she had learned, over the years of feeling it, that the sentence was not about her at all, but about the comfort of the person who delivered it. The women who said such things were never cruel by design. They were women who had organized their understanding of the world around a system that required certain people to remain fixed in certain places, and who experienced any deviation from that arrangement as a threat to the system rather than as a fact about an individual. Lady Prentice was not a villain. She was a woman whose script had worked everywhere it had ever been tried, and who could not quite account for a room that did not behave as her script required. This was not a comfort when the sentence was sitting on the table between you and the guests. It was something to hold. At least, even so. She looked up once, involuntarily. Mr. Gay said. Calder was seated to Lady Prentice's left, which was where one put the tutor at such a dinner, below the invited guests and above the housekeeper, in the geography of social precision. He was looking at Lady Prentice, and his face was completely still, the careful, deliberate stillness of a man exercising a restraint that had cost him something to deploy. That night, Clara lay awake for longer than was practical. Her room at Ashvale was a narrow, decent room on the upper corridor, between the linen press and a storage chamber that no one used. She had arranged it over 2 years into something that suited her. A small writing desk beneath the window, 2 books she had not yet finished, a miniature of her mother on the mantelpiece beside a half-burned candle. It was a governess's room, which was to say it was a room that knew exactly what she was and offered no pretensions otherwise. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about hands. A tutor's hands, properly considered, bore the marks of his profession. The ink was the most obvious indicator, worked into the whorls of the right forefinger, persistent in the crease of the palm no matter how carefully the man washed. The second indicator was a slight softness at the heel of the hand, the softness of someone whose physical work was the movement of a pen across paper, rather than anything that required grip or resistance. The third indicator, less often noted, was a particular tension around the thumb and the index finger, the tension of a man who held his instrument with long habituated precision. Mr. Calder's hands had none of these qualities. They were strong and even, and bore the faint callousing of rope or rein, the marks of someone who had spent years managing something large and unwilling. She had noticed it on the first morning, and filed it under things she had not yet understood, and then she had noticed it again when he had lifted the cracked globe from the shelf, the way his grip was absolutely confident, the way he held the thing as though he already knew its weight. She thought about the way he had walked the room's perimeter on that first day. She thought about the Latin conjugations written on the board in Thomas's afternoon lesson. The hand controlled and precise and formed in the manner of someone educated by a private tutor, of significant cost, not a provincial schoolmaster. She thought about the solicitor's letter from Edinburgh, which was a curious provenance for a man engaged to tutor a boy in the north of England, and which no one had questioned because no one had reason to question it, except that she had reason. The slow accumulating reason of a woman who noticed things and had been given 2 years' worth of this house to notice. She thought about the East Gallery painting. She rose in the night when the house was fully quiet, and the last of the kitchen fire had banked itself into embers, and she took her candle from the mantelpiece and walked along the upper corridor and down the east stair, which she knew well enough to navigate without light, and into the gallery, where the family portraits ranged in their gilt frames along both walls in the order of their succession. The fourth, Duke of Ashvale, was the largest painting. He was depicted in the formal style of the previous decade, standing against a background of his estate in summer, one hand resting on a table with papers on it, the other at his side. He was younger than the painting made him seem on first viewing, she had always thought. The painter had done something with the mouth that aged it, made it too resolved, too deliberate, as though the man in the painting had already decided everything, and was waiting for the world to catch up with his decisions. The eyes had always been the thing she returned to. She lifted her candle. The light moved across the painted face and settled in the eyes, which were dark and level and held something the painter had either captured by accident or understood very well, a quality that was not coldness and was not distance, but was the specific expression of a man carrying a sorrow he had not told anyone about. A sorrow that had become so habitual he no longer knew he wore it. She stood there for some time. She went to bed and slept very little and said nothing to anyone. The following morning, the household began to notice things by March. Collings noticed first, because Collings was the kind of man who catalogued the movements of everyone under him and several of those above him, and the appearance of a tutor who asked questions about grain stores was the kind of irregularity that his system was specifically designed to detect and suppress. He had managed Ashvale for 3 years, since the previous steward had left under circumstances he described as a mutual parting, and others described rather differently. He was competent in the ways that were visible, and careless in the ways that were not, and the not visible ways had accumulated into something that would not survive a proper audit. He knew this. The knowledge was always present, low and steady. The way a pain one has learned to live with is present. The new tutor's questions had a quality that troubled him. They were not the questions of a curious interloper, overstepping out of ignorance. They were the questions of someone who already knew the approximate answers and wished to hear what Collings would offer instead. About the grain stores, yes, and the tenant ledgers, and the 3 farms in the North Quarter that had been without a working well since November, a period during which the affected tenants had written to the trustees and the trustees, through Collings, had received no letters at all. Collings answered with the particular coldness of a man who knows his management is being reviewed and has arranged the books to survive a less searching examination than the one he now suspects is coming. Lady Prentice noticed that the tutor's authority in the house had expanded without her having quite agreed to the expansion. The coal was better. The kitchen garden's spring planting had been arranged without any consultation with her, through a conversation between Mr. Calder and the head gardener that she had not been present for. 3 tenant families who had written letters of complaint to the trustees, letters which Collings had collected and not forwarded, had somehow received responses, and the responses were in a hand she did not recognize. She called Mr. Sebentee, called her to the sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and informed him with the patient precision of someone correcting an inferior who was too slow to correct himself that a tutor's responsibilities extended no further than the schoolroom. "You are," Lady Prentice said, "engaged to educate the boy. You are a tutor and nothing more. What you appear to have forgotten is that this house has a structure, and your place within it is." She held her fan at the familiar angle. "Fixed." "I understand," Mr. Calder said. "Do you?" "Completely," he said. "Pog." "The structure of this house is very clear to me." He did not say anything else. He inclined his head and left the room. And Lady Prentice found, when she reviewed the exchange that evening, that she had not actually told him to stop. It was Thomas who undid him, in the end, not through any revelation or confrontation, but through the simple, unanswerable action of love. They were in the schoolroom on a Saturday morning, when lessons had not been formally arranged, but Thomas often came anyway, because Mr. Calder was usually there, and the schoolroom had become warm, and the boy did not always want to be elsewhere. Clara was at the small desk reviewing her correspondence. She had a letter from her sister in Bath, and she was reading it in the way of someone performing an activity, in order to justify their presence in a place they wished to be. Thomas had a book open on the table and was not reading it. He was watching Mr. Calder, who was mending a small globe that had been cracked along its brass mounting since before Clara had arrived. It required patience and a specific knowledge of the original mechanism, and Mr. Calder had both. "My father used to sit in here," Thomas said. He had not been asked anything. "When he was my age." Mr. Calder did not look up from the globe. "I know," he said. "Griggs told me. He was here when my father was a boy. He says my father was difficult in lessons too, was he? Griggs says he ran away twice. Once he got as far as the village." A pause. "I would not run away. I would not want to leave." Mr. Calder set the globe down. He looked at it for a moment, not at Thomas, and his hands were very still on the table. Clara could see the line of his jaw, which had the quality of something held against considerable pressure. "No," Mr. Calder said. "You would not, Mr. Calder," Thomas said with the directness of a 9-year-old who has decided to ask the question he has been circling for weeks. "Do you know where my father is?" The silence that followed had a texture. Clara was not breathing. She was aware of the fire behind her and the sound of wind at the window, and the particular quality of that silence, which was not the silence of a man who did not know, but the silence of a man deciding what to do with what he did. "Thomas," Mr. Calder said. His voice was low and even. "I would like to speak with Miss Fenwick for a moment. Will you go down to Griggs and ask him to bring up a fresh pot of tea?" Thomas went, because he was 9, and Mr. Fenwick. Calder asked him calmly, and because he trusted the answer would be waiting when he returned. Clara did not move from her chair. She heard the door close. She heard Mr. Calder stand. She arranged her face into whatever expression would serve her best in the next moment, which was not an expression she had needed before, and so did not have ready. "Miss Fenwick," Mr. Calder said. She looked up. He was standing in the middle of the schoolroom, and the mild, careful arrangement of his face had changed. What was beneath it was not cold. It was not distant. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and who has reached the limit of what can be carried alone. "You know," he said. "Not a question. I think," Clara said carefully, "that I suspected. And then I was certain. And then I decided it was not my position to speak." "How long?" The night I went to the gallery. She folded her hands in her lap. The painting! He breathed out a slow, controlled breath and looked at the window. I came back to see what had happened. I expected to observe for 2 weeks and then take appropriate steps through the trustees. A pause. It has been 6 weeks. You stayed for Thomas, she said. I stayed, he said, and his voice shifted very slightly on the second word. Not much, only enough for someone paying close attention to hear the shift, because I found reasons I had not expected. Clara's hands were perfectly still in her lap. Her heart was not. She could feel it against her sternum, present and insistent and apparently ungovernable, which was inconvenient, and also the most honest thing that had happened to her in some time. There are practical considerations, she said, because she was a governess, and she was precise about this sort of thing, and she believed in naming obstacles before they did damage. You are the Duke of Ashvale. I am your son's governess. Yes, he said. He moved to the table and stood with his hands braced on it, not leaning, simply steadying himself. Those are the considerations. Lady Prentice will have a great deal to say. Lady Prentice, he said, has had a great deal to say for some time. I have been listening very carefully, he looked at her. As has everyone in the household, I suspect. She is not unkind, Clara said, because she was fair about things even when they had been unfair to her. She believes what the structure of this house has told her to believe. She is wrong, he said. Not cruelly, simply and completely. About the structure, and about you. Clara stood. She was not certain when she decided to stand, but she was on her feet and across the room from him, and she understood that this was a conversation that could not be had with the table between them. And she understood also that she was afraid in the way one is, afraid of a thing one wants very much and has been told one does not deserve. You have been gone 4 years, she said. There will be questions. Your son will have questions. Yes, he said, he will. And I will answer them. It will be a long conversation, and some of it will be painful, and all of it will be true. He looked at her steadily. I left because I believed I had failed someone I loved. I spent 4 years discovering that the failure was not what I had believed it to be, and that grief, misread, is still grief. But it is no reason to continue living at a distance from everything one is meant to protect. She heard the whole of that. She did not look away. Who did you believe you had failed? My wife, he said quietly. Eleanor. She died of a fever when Thomas was 3. I was abroad when it happened, on business I had chosen over remaining. And she had asked me to stay, and I had not. He was still and even, and the cost of the stillness was visible if you knew how to look. I came home to a child who could not understand why his mother was not there, and a house that had learned to run without me. I convinced myself that Thomas was better without the particular shape of my failures. I was wrong. I have known I was wrong for 2 years. Clara said nothing. She let the whole of it sit in the room without rushing past it. He had a wound, as all cold men do, and his was specific and human, and the kind of grief that compounds itself, the grief of a man who believed his absence was a mercy and discovered too late that mercy is not the same as distance. I am sorry, she said, because she was. She would have liked you. He said she was precise about people. She did not waste the quality. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the letter from her sister in Bath, which contained several careful inquiries about whether she had formed any attachment, because 2 years was a long time, and her sister worried. She thought about Thomas's face when he solved a problem, which was the face of his father without the years of careful management. She thought about a man who had repointed nothing and fixed everything from the inside of a disguise he had already outgrown. What do you intend to do? She asked. I intend, he said, to speak to my son. He paused. And then I intend to speak to Mr. Collings at some length about the condition of the North Quarter wells and the tenant letters he chose not to forward. A pause. And then I would like, if you are willing, to speak with you again, at a time and in a setting that is appropriate to what I would like to say. She understood what he was not quite saying, because he was a man who did not say too much too fast, and she had come to understand him by now. I am, she said. Willing. Thomas came back with the tea before either of them spoke again. He set the tray on the corner table with the careful competence of a boy who has learned that adults sometimes need a moment between sentences. And then he looked at Mr. Calder, and he looked at Clara, and he looked at Mr. Reekray. Calder again, and something in his 9-year-old assessment settled into a different arrangement. You are not really a tutor, Thomas, said Mr. Calder, sat down across from his son. He was not a tutor, and he was not arranging his face into anything other than what it was. He was simply there, in the schoolroom he had sat in as a boy, in the house he had left at the cost of more than he had understood, in the presence of a child who looked at him with eyes that knew already and needed only to be told. No, he said. I am not. Thomas considered this for a long moment. Are you going to stay? He asked. Mr. Calder looked at his son. Then he looked at Clara briefly, with the same quality of attention she had noticed on the first morning, and still could not quite account for, except as truth. Yes, he said, I am going to stay. The conversation that followed took most of the afternoon because Thomas had questions, and they were good ones, and his father answered each one with the patience of a man who understood that he had a debt of honesty that could not be settled in a single exchange. Clara poured the tea and occasionally interjected, and by the time the light began to fail and Griggs came to call Thomas to his supper, the schoolroom felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to miss. Collings was dismissed by the end of the week. He went with the particular injured dignity of a man who had believed his position was permanent and discovered it was contingent, and 3 of the 4 village families who had submitted complaints to the unforwarded ledger received visits from the estate's solicitor within a fortnight. Lady Prentice received the news of the Duke of Ashvale's return and identity on a Wednesday morning when he came to the sitting-room in something other than a worn, clean coat, though he wore it with the same economy. He had worn everything else, and explained himself without apology and without warmth and without anything that could be mistaken for asking her permission. He thanked her for her management of the household in his absence. He noted precisely what that management had and had not included, and he informed her that Miss Fenwick's position in the household would be changing, and that he hoped Lady Prentice would offer the appropriate felicitations when they were warranted. Lady Prentice opened her mouth, and then closed it. She looked at him for a long time with the expression of someone revising a ledger entry they had believed settled. She is a governess, Lady Prentice said finally, reaching for the familiar ground. She is, said the Duke of Ashvale, a woman who remained loyal to my son for 2 years at a wage that I will be rectifying immediately, who maintained the household's dignity when the household had very little to recommend it, and who is, his voice did not change in volume but changed in something else. Something under the volume, worth considerably more than this house has given her to understand. A pause of 3 seconds, clean and controlled. She is the woman I intend to marry, if she will have me. Lady Prentice sat with this sentence for a moment. She spoke finally with the slightly crumpled grace of someone who has been on the losing side of a public correction and has the wisdom to recognize it. She would be an unusual choice, she said. Yes, said the Duke. I believe that is precisely the point. He proposed on a Thursday evening in the library, which was where they had most often ended up in the long February evenings when Thomas was in bed and the house was quiet. He was not on his knee because the library had 2 armchairs by the fire and they had both been sitting in them. And he proposed from his chair, without ceremony, without poetry, without any of the elaborate architecture of a man trying to impress rather than ask. He said her name Clara. He had not used it before, and the sound of it in his voice was a different thing than the sound of it anywhere else, and she felt that, in her spine. He said he was aware of all the practical considerations. He said he was aware that the world would have its commentary. He said he had spent the past 4 years learning to locate what mattered, and that he had spent the past 6 weeks learning something specific he had not expected to learn. "I would like you to be here," he said. "Not as the governess, not as the woman who stayed because Thomas needed someone. I would like you to stay for your own reasons. If you find you have them, I find I do," she said. He leaned across the small distance between the chairs and took her hand. He held it for a moment, not kissing it, simply holding it, her fingers in his, the warmth of the fire on both of them, the house quiet around them, Thomas asleep upstairs with the repaired globe on the windowsill, turning in the last of the evening light. "Then it is settled," he said. She smiled, which was not a thing she did for effect. "It is settled," she agreed. They stayed in the library for another hour, talking. Not about the wedding, or the trustees, or callings, or Lady Prentice. They talked about Thomas, and about the Southfield wall, and about a letter he was going to write to the 3 northern farms, and about what she wanted for the schoolroom when the budget was restored to something reasonable. They talked like 2 people who intend to be in the same place for a long time and have a great deal of ground to cover, and the fire burned down around them, and neither of them moved to add to it until it was necessary. If this story moved you, leave your thoughts below. There are more stories of quiet courage waiting here, whenever you need one. Spring came late to Ashvale. And then came all at once, the way spring does in that part of England, the grey lifting in a single week, to reveal a green that seemed to have been there all along, waiting with patience. The Southfield wall was repointed in April by a mason from the village who took an extra day and did it properly. The kitchen garden came in thick. The 3 northern wells were dug before May. Thomas had his birthday on the 16th of April, which fell on a Sunday, and he spent most of it in the schoolroom, because the schoolroom was where he still preferred to be. And his father sat at the corner table for the afternoon, and his stepmother-to-be read aloud from a natural philosophy book that had arrived from London that week. And the globe turned on the sill, and the fire kept the room warm. And the boy looked from his father to Clara and back again, with the settled proprietary satisfaction of someone who has arranged exactly what he wanted, and is wise enough to say nothing about it. The painting in the East Gallery was not turned to the wall. It remained as it had always been, the 4th Duke of Ashvale in his regalia, younger than his years and carrying something quiet in the eyes. Clara had stopped reading it as sorrow, though she walked past it now, and read it instead as the particular expression of a man with a great deal still to do, and a long way to go to do it, and the willingness to begin. She carried a small folded letter in the pocket of her gray morning dress. A letter Thomas had given her on the day after his father had introduced her to the household in her new capacity. He had written it himself, in the careful hand of a boy who was improving quickly, and it said in his careful hand that he was glad she had stayed. She had read it once and folded it, and put it in her pocket, and had not needed to read it again. She knew what it said.